Hi everyone, good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to a webinar hosted by the Cloud Standards Customer Council, the latest developments in cloud security standards and privacy. My name is Tracy Berardi, Program Manager of the CSCC, and thanks for joining us today. In September, the Cloud Council published an update to our guide on cloud security standards. The link to the paper, it's right here on this slide. It's at the bottom. And the content within this presentation, or the content of this presentation is really draws from this deliverable. We also have a link to it in the attachments tab. If you're new here to the CSCC, I'd like to introduce you to some of my colleagues who've joined me. They helped to write this great deliverable that we have here today. Mr. Claude Boudoir, Principal at Sebe IT and Knowledge Management. Mr. Mike Edwards, a cloud computing standards expert and Bluemix PaaS evangelist at IBM. Mr. Alexander Tumashov, IT Cloud and Server Integration Manager at Schlumberger. And there were other folks from the Cloud Council who contributed. We couldn't all be on the call today, but we thank everyone for their contributions. And moving on, so you're aware of what we do, the Cloud Standards Customer Council, and have some other pointers to deliverables that we've written on other topics. The CSCC works with standards bodies, open source groups, and cloud customers to publish vendor-neutral guides on important cloud computing topics like security and privacy, as well as the content of cloud service agreements. And our work helps to influence standards of practice by highlighting customer requirements and best practices. So we've published a significant number of deliverables since our inception 5 years ago. This year we've written a practical guide to hybrid cloud computing, an update to our public cloud service agreements guide, as well as a series of reference architectures, most recently covering how to support IoT using cloud computing and how to support e-commerce solutions using cloud computing. So we encourage you to visit our site, cloud-council.org. All this material is posted to our resource hub. And if you're interested in becoming a member, it is a free membership, and you're welcome to contribute to some of our content. We're planning 2017 right now, so we'd love to have you in our network. And in the attachments tab, you can download, we have a PDF copy of today's presentation, as well as a link to our Cloud Security Standards Guide that we are talking about today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Claude to start the presentation. Thanks, Claude.
Thank you, Tracy. So I'm Claude Boudoir, and I am going to take you through the first few slides of the meat of this presentation, and then the other presenters will come in with the sections on which they're particularly expert on. So the first thing is some of you may have been familiar with the previous version of this deliverable. There was a version 1 that was published about 3 years ago. And what's new in version 2, and I just lost my internet connection, unfortunately, so I can't see what I'm doing, is that we've taken into account a lot of the evolution of the standards. So there's been some work done in particular in the area of cloud security in particular. So we'll talk several times about this standard called ISO 19086. There's also been a lot of additional awareness that has built up in the community of users. So certainly in 3 years, the level of understanding and the level of concern about this has increased. The vendor landscape has changed, and so there's somewhat different positioning of various vendors. And generally speaking, there has been a lot of learning about this by various organizations. The laws and regulations have changed a lot. So in the area of privacy and data protection, there's certainly a lot more, and there's been incidents that have been well publicized, including the Microsoft lawsuit with the FBI, et cetera, et cetera. So the landscape has changed fairly significantly. So we've updated the paper to reflect that. Going to the next slide. So I'm going to ask Tracy to advance the slides on the presentation because I am viewing a static copy now. So I'm on slide 5, Tracy.
No problem. I got it. Yep.
Thank you. So what are the benefits of cloud security standards? Well, they promote interoperability by making sure that it's going to be easier for you to move from one vendor to another. That interoperability can be between different cloud vendors, or it can be between cloud vendors and your own on-premises implementation of IT solutions. And the standards also allow vendors and yourself to know how to establish that you're compliant with best practices. Therefore, they level the playing ground. They make it possible to compare various offerings. If you are certified or your cloud provider is certified as conforming to certain standards, then you will have an easier time proving that you're compliant with whatever are the regulations that your particular domain, whether you're in healthcare, in finance, or whatever, forces you to be compliant with. If we go to the next slide, the current landscape of cloud security standards is that they're maturing, they're evolving, that you don't necessarily need to look only for cloud-specific standards. All the previously existing general IT security standards certainly apply to cloud computing, and therefore your providers should follow those. And those standards are now accompanied by certain security certifications. And if you're a customer of the cloud, you need to ask your providers what certifications they have. We've sort of classified the standards into several categories. You have advisory standards. If you want, you could call them guidelines, but they're really more in the area of best practices than hard technical stuff. You'll find a couple of ISO standards in there, plus the COBIT standards, which is a governance and IT management standard. Then you have security frameworks that are more specific. They're a little bit harder, if you want. They really define checklists, procedures, policies, etc. And again, in that area, you have some ISO standards, 27001, and then 17 and 18, which are more directed towards outsourcers and cloud providers. And then you have standard specifications, which are very technical things. They define APIs or web services or interfaces or protocols that can be used to make things more secure. And we give you some examples in there. Moving on to slide 7. And I will not read all these 10 steps. You can download those slides, as Tracy said, and you can download the paper. But just be aware that in the paper, as well as in a companion paper called Cloud Computing 10 Steps to Ensure Success, we've defined 10 steps that cover all the aspects of how you make your security position as rigorous and as secure as you can possibly be, knowing that nothing's perfect. So it goes from governance and management to some of the technical aspects of authorization and access control and defense in depth of the cloud, to the human aspects of how your cloud provider makes sure that their personnel isn't the weak link in the chain. So if you follow those 10 steps, in our opinion, you will be in a better position to ensure that your operations are secure, and that if you have external customers, it's like if you're a bank, if you have account holders, if you're a healthcare organization, you have patients, that their information is not put as much at risk as if you didn't take care of some of the aspects of this. So with that said, I'm going to pass on the baton for the next slide to my colleague Alexander Tumashov, who is going to take you through the first few steps.
Thank you, Claude. I'm gonna cover first 4 steps for you, and the first step here is the governance, risk, and compliance. So GRC model is pretty well known for everybody. Companies trying to look into these 3 words as a single entity, right, to sustain their business within regulatory requirements and acceptable risk level. So difference between normal environments or legacy environments and cloud environment is that now you have a third-party partner who has to be a significant part of this GRC model. Risk level and requirements here will have a different value with different implementations, but they have to be assessed and addressed by customer. Organizations that are able to actively demonstrate an effective governance, risk, and compliance usually provide a competitive environment to the market. So to be able to sustain same GRC level as it was before in the cloud environment, companies have to evaluate their GRC requirements against available industry standards. And they have to enforce them to be a critical part for a new cloud implementations. All the certifications on the right side that you can see on the slide can be used during assessment process. In some cases, those requirements could be a deal breaker for you go to the cloud, and another just good to have validation for the security level of the cloud service provider. But this will be driven by the company requirements, right? In terms of regulations that they have, risk tolerance level, general IT requirements, and maybe you will have some, other country or industry-specific requirements, like data residency and et cetera, et cetera. For instance, ISO 20000 and ITIL could be a good source for IT service management guidelines. ISO 27001 and 2 would guide you for risk and security controls. COBIT would help you or your IT parts of the company to stay connected to the business goals and requirements from the business side. PCI, HIPAA, FedRAMP, Privacy Shield on the lower parts of the slide will give you a good understanding on data privacy regulations. Also, there are 2 standards that have been specifically designed for the cloud environment. It's ISO 27017 and 18. The first one is focused on the cloud security, and the one is focused on the PII data on the cloud. So the second step, audit and audit operational and business processes. I believe that everybody knows that audit is a critical part of assurance process, right? And during the implementation and lifecycle periods of the cloud services, you have to make sure that cloud service provider is always in compliance with all requirements that we mentioned before. There are several industry standards which serve to prove organizational ongoing commitment to quality and customer satisfaction in different aspects. Independent reviews and assessments shall be performed at least annually and available to you to ensure that the organization addresses non-compliances for the policies and standards and procedures in place. Most popular or well accepted, if you will, standards or certifications are ISO 27000 series and the SSAE 16, which is focused on the providers who has a significant financial impact on their customers. Also, in white paper, we outline several services that may help customer to assure that providers are compliant, and that can be done in automated fashion. Step number 3, identity and access management. So now it is very important for you to make sure that you have good identity and access management because of you expose your data and your credentials to the cloud, right? So based on the data classification that you have in your company and risk level, you may want to enforce some additional controls to your cloud offerings. This control will improve security from IT and user standpoint. So if you implement federation, you can enforce your password policies and automate user provisioning and deprovisioning processes. At the same time, you can help users to remember only one corporate password for the all business applications. Moreover, single sign-on would authorize them without prompting the passwords all the time they go to the business application within trusted environment. In some cases, multi-factor authentication would be a strong requirement, and I think that has to be a mandatory actual requirement for the privileged accounts, admin accounts, or accounts that they have more than normal users' rights on the application. There are several technologies that provide federation capabilities that provide single sign-on and multi-factor authentication. You have here SAML, Oath, OpenID, and others. So customer has to review their security requirements and make sure that cloud provider can deliver this type of technologies, and you are ready to consume those technologies. So make sure that your environment is ready to use SAML or Oath or OpenID for implementing these kind of technologies. So step number 4 is around the data protection. So again, everybody knows that data is the main asset for both customer and the cloud provider. At the same time, usually customer is a ultimate data owner, right? And he is responsible for all liability and regulation obligations. And also, the data leakage or data loss could affect his reputation and overall business. So to mitigate this risk, sometimes you can use legal obligation between a cloud service provider and the customer, right? But there are additional IT standard encryption techniques which would help to enforce data protection as well as data at rest and in transit. And I think that the data flow framework has to be very carefully reviewed from security standpoint, and all necessary measures like encryption have to be implemented based on your data classification. For the encryption in transit, you can use HTTPS, SFTP, VPN under SSL, TLS. So we have a list of possible implementations here on this slide. But the most important thing in here is that encryption doesn't mean full protection for your data. So to make sure that you're protected, first, implement encryption protocols and techniques that are up to date. Always check if your protocols that you're using are compliant with the current security requirements. Also, encryption key ownership has to be at the right place. So you have to understand how critical for you to keep the encryption key, and if you have these capabilities. Also, from the step number 3, you have to make sure that your access identity and access management is mature enough, and monitor and always audit the process, data flow process for non-compliances against your current security standard. So, Mike.
Thank you, Alex. So moving on from looking at the protection of data, we look at the protection of personal data. So this often goes under the title of privacy, and really is all about the acquisition, the storage, and then the use of any data that's personally identifiable that can be tied back to individuals. And this is an area that is continually gaining in importance, and there are increasingly laws and regulations that apply to how this data is handled. So we find that privacy requirements can include limitations on what usage can be made of personal information, and also limitations on who is allowed to access that data. It requires that the personal data is tagged appropriately, so you know where it is and who it belongs to. The data is stored securely. That often means in some sort of encrypted format, and that only authorized users are allowed access to that data. And then specific types of personal information will require special treatment. So we have the well-known HIPAA regulations applying to health data in the USA. There are equivalent regulations around the world for very sensitive personal data of that kind. And then for financial credit card data, there are the PCI DSS standards required to be met by people who are holding that kind of personal data. We have now, of course, the new European Union General Data Protection Regulation, which is about all kinds of personal information and its storage and use. And you need to comply to a whole set of requirements if you ever hold personal data of European Union subjects, citizens rather. And so that's a big new issue, because it was passed as a law this year. And if you do have systems that deal with European citizens, you'll need to be taking on board the extra requirements that those regulations are bringing to the table. When you're using cloud services, then the main issues for privacy should be addressed in the Cloud Service Agreement. You can see more information on that in the Cloud Standard Customer Council paper on Cloud Service Agreements. And there is also now the new ISO standard on cloud SLAs, the 19086 standard, the first part of which was published just a couple of months back. These are all things you should pay attention to, and when you're planning to use a cloud service to hold personal data, you should take them very seriously. There's also another standard that applies to cloud services, and indeed quite a number of cloud service providers have already been certified for various of their services to this new standard, and that is the 27018 Cloud Privacy Standard. Again, very useful to read that to understand what obligations there are on cloud service providers if they're going to store personal data in the cloud services, and what information they should be making available to cloud service customers to understand what their services actually do. So that was the thorny area of personal data. Let's move on now and think about cloud applications, because in many cases, of course, we're going to want to put cloud applications up in cloud services, or we may be wanting to use existing cloud applications made available to us by cloud service providers. Now, you need to think about application security in the cloud over the complete life cycle. So we're looking at secure development of the applications, followed by secure deployment into the production environment. And associated with that is also the ongoing security testing required for the applications that are being put up into the cloud environment. Now, there are various standards that can help with this, and standards and guidelines. One of the well-known set of guidelines for application development are the OWASP materials, which you can find online. And related to those is the ISO 27734 standard that makes, in effect, a standard out of very much the same area of discussion about how to do development. For testing of security capabilities, you should be looking at the excellent NIST paper 800-115, which talks about all the things you need to be able to do in terms of testing your application to make sure there are no vulnerabilities and security holes. I think that that's an excellent paper, and you would be well advised to go use it. In addition, these days, you're finding more and more security services being provided off the shelf by many cloud providers to help you do this. So some of the security testing capabilities, for example, are available as cloud services, which you can go and subscribe to and then use against your applications to check for various vulnerabilities. Now, the deployment model you're using for the application will impact application security. If you're using infrastructure as a service, so basic compute and storage capabilities, then you as the customer who builds and deploys the application are responsible for the majority of security components. You've got to ensure, for example, that firewalls are in place. You've got to ensure that appropriate ID and access management controls are in place. Platform as a service, where much of the software stack is being provided by the cloud service provider, although the application itself belongs to you as the customer. In this case, the provider is often responsible for securing that operating system, middleware, the software stack itself, and maybe providing such things as firewalls off the shelf as part of the platform as a service offering. You need to check out very carefully what's provided by default and what things you are responsible for as the customer whose application is being deployed into the service. Finally, software as a service, where you're getting a whole running application off the shelf from the cloud service provider. You would expect in that case the provider should be providing most of the application security. They should be worried that they've done appropriate development, secure development, and they've securely deployed their application into their cloud environment. And indeed, they are responsible for the testing as well in most cases. However, you as the customer may still be left needing to think about data encryption standards for any data you put into the service, what audit capabilities you have against the cloud service provider to make sure they are doing what they say they're doing, and you need to be very aware of the SLAs and terms in the cloud service agreement that describe what security and privacy provisions are in place with the service. So moving on from the applications and their security implications, we can next look at the cloud networks and the security issues that relate to those. So these are often independent considerations from the applications and the data stores that you're using. You need to think about both the external network security that's going from your users to the cloud service where the application is running. You also need to think about internal networks that are being used within the provider's environment, such as from the place that your application is running to, say, a back-end database where your database is being stored. And as always with security, the main areas of concern for these networks are confidentiality of the data, integrity of the data, it's not being tampered with, and ensuring availability, that you don't get breakages in the availability of your application due to some failure in the networking. Now, when dealing with external networks, the sort of things you may be worrying about are screening of the traffic that's coming in to your application. Make sure that it's legitimate stuff and we're not getting bad guys trying to attack your applications. You certainly would be looking at intrusion detection, looking to prevent people who should not have access getting inside your systems. And then last but not least, the ability to log events that are occurring, for example, and generate notifications when things appear to happen that are unexpected or outside your normal security policies. Then there are internal network requirements within the cloud service domain itself. And here we need to be thinking about measures that protect one client of the cloud service provider from another, that protect the cloud provider's network. You know, they usually have a network that manages the cloud service platform itself. You want to make sure that that network is well protected, can't be got at either from the internet or from the networks being used by applications deployed in the cloud, and the ability to monitor therefore intrusion attempts and indeed report them to customers where they are relevant to the customer applications. In terms of standards that apply in this area, there's an excellent set of standards under the ISO 27033 number, which squarely address various issues relating to network security. The NIST 800-53 R4 paper has a very useful set of network security controls described, the sort of things that you should have in place. And then FedRAMP, which applies primarily to US government installations, that has a set of specific controls that many customers who are outside the government also take on board and use because they're well researched and well understood. So moving on to our next element, and that is the security controls on physical infrastructure and facilities. Now, of course, when you're using a cloud service, the physical infrastructure you're using is that belongs to the cloud provider. So you as a customer are not directly responsible for the physical security of that infrastructure, but you are responsible for understanding, for getting some assurance that the provider is doing the right things in terms of physical security. So you want to understand that the infrastructure itself, the facilities, are in a secure area. They don't have access from anyone, it's controlled and so on. You want to be assured that the facility is protected against external and environmental threats, flooding, disturbance by weather events and so on. You want to know that personnel in those areas are controlled, that only appropriate authorized people have access, that appropriate security controls apply to the equipment that's in the area. They can't be switched off by mistake, for example. That the supporting utilities like power, like telecommunications, are controlled, that they can't be accidentally or maliciously damaged, or that they have backup systems in place if some damage does occur. You want to be assured that any assets that are in the data center, if they have to be removed and disposed of, they may contain some of your data. So we need to be assured that we have secure disposal techniques that assure you that the data doesn't get into the wrong hands. So you need to be getting assurance that this stuff's going on. You're not normally going to go to the data center and audit it or inspect it. What you need to be doing is looking for appropriate certifications in place where there have been audits done of the data center and you get a certificate issued to that effect. So look out for certifications to ISO 27001, for example, which has a whole series of physical security controls in place, The other one that you might look out for is the ANSI standard TIA 942, which is all about physical security of data centers, and some customers like to insist on the controls present in that standard as part of their assurance about the cloud service provider. Okay, with that, I'd like to hand back over to Claude to finish off our presentation today. Over to you, Claude.
Thank you, Mike. Let me make sure we advance the slide. We're not there yet. Okay, so, did I advance twice? Sorry about that. Thank you, Tracy. So we have 2 steps left. Step 9 is to basically manage the content of the cloud the cloud service agreement, the CSA, in terms of security. So as you know, a lot of the obligations of the provider, as well as what the provider may have to do in order to compensate the customer if the service levels and the service factors are not being met, is defined in a set of documents. And the CSCC has other publications regarding what should be the content of the CSA and how, what are the things that you need to expect will be in a CSA and will be inflexible versus the things that you can potentially negotiate. So when you look, and the CSA is sometimes a combination of multiple documents which include a sort of master contract, an acceptable use policy, and a service level agreement document. So what are you looking for in there in terms of security? Well, first of all, you're looking at a definition of who's going to be responsible for what. So Mike mentioned, the different levels of implication that the provider and the customer have in various aspects of security, depending which deployment model you use, SaaS, PaaS, or IaaS. But the CSA should basically say things like, who's responsible for monitoring certain things, who's responsible for alerting the other party, and who's responsible for, password management and things like that. So that set of definitions of roles and responsibilities is going to be the basis for everything else. Notification is often something that is not well defined. So if there is evidence of a security breach, or a denial of service or anything, you don't want to be alerted by one of our users, especially if it's a customer outside, that they can get to your e-commerce application before the cloud service on which this e-commerce application runs has told you, hey, we're having a problem here, stand by, we're doing something about it, this is the situation. So the notification and the speed of that notification are critical. And then if there is an incident, what are the measures that the cloud provider is going to take, and what sort of commitments can they make about the speed and the effectiveness of that recovery? If data is being deleted, will they take responsibility for restoring it? And how will they compensate you for the loss of service due to the security incident? And there is issues about, who's responsible for the performance of the subcontractors. So all this can be defined in terms of metrics, and some of these metrics are in the various standards listed in the 5th bullet on the left of the slide, or some of the things on the right-hand side of that slide. And some of these things, I'm not going to list all the standards, but I just want to point out one of the next to last logo on the right-hand side about the Cloud Security Alliance and the STAR registry, because I saw that one of our attendees asked a question about the STAR registry. So we can take the question more fully later, but yes, clearly that is one of the sources of information for a customer about which providers are doing what and are committing to what in terms of the security aspects of their service agreement. So we now go to step 10, and although we don't like to think about it, the relationship between a cloud service provider and a cloud service customer is not necessarily going to last forever. It is almost certain that one way or another this relationship will end at some point, either because you've decided that you want to work with another provider, or because that provider announces that they're going to go out of business and they trigger a termination process on their end, whatever reason. Or because your company is acquired by another one which uses another service and they tell you that you need to dismantle what you had done. And that termination process can be complex, and it can leave the situation in a fairly dirty state where data is still held by the cloud provider, even though normally the relationship having ended, that provider has no right anymore to hold on to your data. But just by virtue of making backups, for instance, for your own protection, they may have, lots of tape cartridges or whatever it is that they back up on that are being held in their disaster recovery vault. So the right to be forgotten, the right for all your data to be deleted is not technically necessarily easy to implement. And those procedures and what is going to be achieved during the termination process definitely need to be spelled out, and you need to think about it in advance. It is not at the time when the exit process is being triggered and you potentially have a tense situation with the provider that you need to start discussing what is going to happen in the case of termination. So again, the new ISO 19086 standard, which we've already referred to several times, contains language on the exit process. And frankly, it is pretty much the first time that any standard with the stature, if you want, of an ISO standard has been mentioning this, and that's why that's the only logo and title present in the right column here. But that is clearly a key resource for you to understand what you should be looking at in terms of the exit process. So we now looked at the 10 steps, and what remains to be done is to understand how you're going to get some significant assurance that your cloud provider is following all the best practices and some of the standards we've mentioned. And the key to that is certification. You're not going to be able to go in as an individual customer unless you're a huge company and audit yourself, your cloud provider, because that cloud provider would have to lend themselves to an audit by each of their customers if they accepted that, and that would be time consuming and intrusive, etc. So the best solution is to have a trustable third party, Bureau Veritas or whatever. I'm not taking sides here. There's multiple organizations that do that can go in and perform all the necessary investigation using one of the ISO standards as their list of things to find and questions to ask, and can then issue a certificate which gives you a certain level of assurance that the provider complies with that standard. Now, one of the things you should be looking at is if someone provides you a certification, how long ago was it issued? And does the provider have a commitment to renew this certification on an annual basis? Because things change, and there will be new standards, etc., and there will be new points that will be discovered as having more importance than we thought. So this is not something that a provider needs to do once. It's something they need to do repeatedly. And we've listed here some of the relevant certifications to look for. So in conclusion, I think we're getting near the conclusion. You need to expect your cloud service provider, CSP, to support certain suitable standards that range all the way from general governance standards all the way to very specific, very technical standards about data security, encryption, etc. You need to look for the certifications that they should follow. And this slide is actually a pretty good list of the questions you need to ask one of your potential providers in terms of what they support. And there was, again, take this slide, but also take the full paper as guidance as you engage in those discussions with those providers. So I hope that this has given you a certain useful guideline and actionable items on how to proceed to improve the chances that your cloud implementation will be secure and will meet your governance, regulation, compliance, and privacy and data protection goals, which are obviously at this point in time one of the preeminent things to look for in any use of any IT resources, given the level of cyber attacks and the risks that we've seen and the risks to a business of data breaches, data loss, etc. So if you want to continue to not only, I would say, read what the CSCC outputs in terms of deliverables with this kind of advice in terms of service levels, in terms of security, in terms of architecture, etc., I certainly want to reiterate the call to join the CSCC. It is free, so there's very little obstacle in terms of obtaining authorization to do that in your own organization. And of course, if you join the CSCC, that will not change anything about your access to the finalized documents, because all our deliverables are public, but it will allow you to have an impact by participating earlier on in the process. So you will be able to give feedback on what are the next deliverables we should work on, what are the reasons why some previous deliverables need to be updated because the situation has changed. You'll be able to participate in these webinars, potentially as an author and presenter. And generally speaking, you'll have a voice in defining our roadmap. So you have the, sorry for the background noise, you have the instructions here about how to join. And then there are several working groups that you can join in order to participate in the creation of the deliverables. And on our website, you can find all our existing collateral, and there's 20 or 25 or 30 different papers over the years that we've written now. So quite a rich collection. So with that, I want to thank my colleagues, and I want to thank you for listening. And I'm going to ask Tracy to, in the 12 remaining minutes, to try to handle some of the questions that may have arisen. So if you haven't asked a question and you can, go to the question tab on your screen and enter a question so that we can take it in the next minutes. Tracy?
Perfect. Thanks, Claude, and Mike, and Alex. That's very, very helpful. We do have a few questions. First question. The Cloud Security Alliance, CSA, has introduced StarWatch, which is a software as a service application to help organizations manage compliance with the CSA STAR, which is Security, Trust, and Assurance Registry requirements. Have any of you used it, and do you think this is a good tool? I think, Alex, you might be able to provide some comments here.
Yes, so I've been involved into the pilot assessments of the CSA StarWatch, and we're going to do the production assessments later in December, I believe. But I mean, it's a great tool, right? It's a good source for some of the information. But the biggest concerns or improvements that I want to see from this tool that we mentioned was like they have 300 questions, right? And for the cloud service providers, it's painful to answer all of those questions, and sometimes they're not relevant to the business you're running. So I've asked them if we can set our own defined list of critical controls that we are interested in instead of watching all these 300 things. And again, I don't know if that was implemented right now or not. Also, we asked them to set some priorities and weights to get the score for cloud application for our company, right, based on our requirements. Another one was related to collaboration. Can we share the assessments with the other companies within our industry? Let's say if it's an oil and gas company, we want to share, I don't know, Salesforce assessments or Box.com or whatever company with our, friends company, right? So with our clients in the oil and gas industry, and that was not implemented this time. So last 2 points related to the StarWatch. I've asked them to also implement these kind of things. Right now, they have security controls that are available on the application, but they have no controls that are implemented, right? So available versus implemented for us, because of it could be available on the cloud services, let's say encryption or federation, but in some cases customers are not implementing these kind of controls. And the last point was how often they're gonna update, and that's the biggest concern. How often they're gonna update these questionnaires, right? And how we can report misleading information. Let's say they have one information on this StarWatch, and when we talk to the cloud service provider, we found that it's really another one answer, right? So how we can report this kind of stuff, how we can automate this reporting instead of contacting CSA, directly. So that were the concerns, but it's still great tool and source of information that would be very valuable for you.
Thank you, Alex. And we'll move on unless Mike or Claude, do you have any thoughts you'd like to contribute? Okay. Next question. It's about the validity of the self-assessment of security standards. This person is just asking about our opinion, on the validity of self-assessment.
Well, Claude here. If you're talking about a self-assessment by a provider, I'm not very fond of those because I never know when a provider provides a self-assessment of their security capabilities, if this was written by, a technical person, by a compliance person, by a marketing person, and by a salesperson. Sorry, I hope there's not too many salespeople on the call that I just insulted, but I'm really, and I think my colleagues here are probably in agreement with me, but I'll let them speak, that assessments by third parties are much more rigorous and much more credible than self-assessments. The one thing that you could do a self-assessment of is of your own security capabilities, so that when you are shopping for a cloud solution center, you realize that you don't necessarily need to ask for 100% if your own performance right now has its own deficiencies, and you can select someone who will give you a better solution. So using some of these standards to do your own self-assessment in order to verify that a cloud provider is actually going to give you a better posture than what you might have been having if you're transitioning some on-premises service to the cloud, that may be a good idea. But accepting a self-assessment from a provider who doesn't, quite tell you exactly why it is that they cannot provide you a certification from a professional organization, I would, dig deeper and find out if it's really credible. Mike, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm afraid I think that, if you like, the gold standard is always third-party audits, and in the cloud computing world, that really comes down to certificates being published, by reputable third-party organizations. And I think everything else is going to fall short of that standard. So I would certainly be looking for good third-party certifications, and again, using appropriate standards you want, widely agreed, audit standards to apply. So, ISO 27001 is probably the top of the list in most cases, but of course, if you have specific requirements, you're in the health care industry or other industries with special requirements, you should be looking for certification standards that are relevant to your business. I don't think there's any shortcuts in this area.
Great, thank you. And the next question, asking if we have any connection to Cloud Foundry. And I was just pulling up our website here, cloud-council.org, because the answer is yes. And over the summer, we had we do special guest webinars as well through the CSCC, where we invite in our partners and liaison organizations. And in June, yes, we had the folks from Cloud Foundry come in to talk about what's new with the platform. And also, yes, a lot of our members are also involved in Cloud Foundry as well. Perhaps Mike, Claude, and others would like to speak a bit about that. So the question was, do you have any connection to Cloud Foundry?
Well, I mean, for those who don't know what Cloud Foundry is an open source software for platforms of service, and it is used by a number of organizations, including IBM, but including many others, for building their public PaaS offer. Also used by many customer organizations for building their own internal private PaaS implementations as well. But there's no direct link to Cloud Council other than we've talked about it as an example of a PaaS platform. And it is mentioned indeed in the Cloud Standards Customer Council paper on PaaS systems as one example among a number of PaaS offerings that's available, both in public offerings and also for private installation as well. So that's where it's coming from.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that this slide up here on the screen, the last link, the Resource Hub link, you can find the practical guide to Platform as a Service. That's the title of the paper if you'd like to check that out. And then our events page, which is just cloud-council.org/events. Back on June 25th, there's a really good webinar as well if you'd like to catch up on some of Cloud Foundry's work. Maybe we have time for one more, and this is actually the last question, and it's probably pretty quick. If I have operations outside of the U.S. and Europe, what should I be looking at? There's lots of local regulations, and we couldn't cover them all here today, but maybe we could speak a bit about, privacy and data residency considerations. Anyone?
Mike, go ahead, Mike.
The simple answer, it's a minefield. If you're having to operate currently in Europe, because the General Data Protection Regulation, for example, is being passed by the European Parliament, has to be translated into local laws by each of the countries, which takes up to 2 years. At the moment, a patchwork of laws and regulations in the European Union, and that means difficulties. You have to understand the market you're entering, and there are some special rules for some countries which limit, for example, where you might be able to store and process data. Even within the European Union with current laws, the new GDPR aims to get rid of that, so that any European Union data should be processed somewhere in the European Union. But there's no substitute for understanding carefully the rules and regulations that apply in the particular country that you're going to deal with for the particular kind of data that you're dealing with. And you need to be very aware if you're in stuff like healthcare systems, where you're dealing with health data, for example, there are usually local regulations that apply to those, and you just have to go and find what they are for that country or for the set of countries you're going to deal with. And there are no easy shortcuts at the moment, I'm afraid. I don't know what your view is on that, Claude.
I agree with you. It's complicated. I'm actually in charge of a data residency working group within the object management group, and Tracy here, who hosted this, is actually also involved in this with me. So if someone in the audience wants to know more about what we're doing about trying to document the landscape of data residency, in particular, send a message to Tracy at omg.org, and she'll get me in touch with you, etc. And we can tell you not only how we can help you, but also perhaps how you can help us. And I think with that we're out of time, and I don't think that we have any more pending questions, Tracy.
That's right. We did good. Right at the top of the hour, and so thank you everyone for joining us today, and thanks to our speakers. And become a member if you'd like to get event invitations right to your inbox. That's a lot of what I do, and we'd be happy to have you down the road. So thanks, and have a good rest of the day. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.